And thanks for all the people who made who helped arrange this talk. This is my first time in Nepal. I've been here for a week now, really enjoying it. And it's fun being particularly at Rangchen Yeshe because I've heard of it for so many years. Quite a few of our students have come from Rangchen Yeshe. So I'm going to there's no PowerPoint, there's no images. I'm just going to read this talk and hopefully you will find it of interest. We'll see. So let me begin. In the well-known story of the Buddhist life, can everybody hear me, by the way? Is that clear? In the well-known story of the Buddhist life, at age 29, Prince Siddhartha rejects the sumptuous life of the royal palace and embarks on the path of a shramana, a mendicant who abandons home and family and adopts a celibate ascetic lifestyle in search of liberation. According to canonical sources, Siddhartha first trains under Ānanda Kalama, who teaches him the abode of nothingness. Siddhartha proves to be a gifted student and completely masters Ānanda's doctrinal and yogic curriculum, prompting Ānanda to declare Siddhartha to be his equal. But Ānanda's teachings don't yield the peace that Siddhartha is looking for, so he continues on his search. Siddhartha then studies under Udraka Ramaputra, who instructs him in the abode of neither perception nor non-perception. Once again, Siddhartha masters the teaching, and like Ānanda, Udraka Ramaputra declares Siddhartha to be his equal. But Siddhartha is still not satisfied. Disillusioned, he sets out to find his own way. Siddhartha then joins up with 5 very dedicated shramanas, and together they engage in a very rigorous regime of self-mortification that includes punishing fasts and learning to stop breathing. Siddhartha pushes himself to the very brink of death, at which point he realizes that this too is not getting him anywhere. So after 6 years of grueling mental and physical discipline, he decides to forsake the uncompromising forms of asceticism popular among the shramanas of his day and seek an alternative path. He takes some food, he sits himself under a tree, he vanquishes Mara, and in the span of a single night discovers the true path to the end of suffering. He becomes a Buddha. Now, you all know this story. Versions of it have been disseminated and celebrated throughout the Buddhist world for over 2,000 years. But curiously, it begs a question that is often overlooked by classical commentators and modern scholars alike. Namely, could Siddhartha have attained Buddhahood without first having undergone his grueling 6-year ordeal? Now, one reason the question doesn't come up, perhaps, is that the answer may seem all too obvious. After all, Siddhartha became the Buddha upon discovering the middle path, a doctrine that explicitly repudiates the need for the kinds of ascetic practices in which he previously had engaged. But this response just sidesteps the question. Was Siddhartha's 6-year ordeal nevertheless a precondition for his very discovery? What, in other words, is the relationship between the path that he discovered under the Bodhi tree and the preceding 6 years of intense ascetic toil? Now, in my talk today, I'm going to argue that this question is more significant than it may first appear. It lays bare a conundrum at the very heart of Buddhist path theory. I will further argue that the well-known tale of Ananda's attainment of arhatship is evidence that this conundrum was familiar to Buddhist writers from early on. And finally, I will take the opportunity to present a revisionist reading of the much maligned figure of Ananda. So let's start with a closer look at the narrative of the Buddha's awakening. As mentioned above, Siddhartha is reported to have mastered the abode of nothingness and the abode of neither perception nor non-perception under the guidance of Ānanda Kalama and Udraka Ramaputra, respectively. In Buddhist doctrine, these 2 attainments comprise the highest of the 4 formless abodes or formless states, the arupya samapatti. Accordingly, commentators both ancient and modern, presume that Siddhartha learned all four of the formless attainments from his two teachers. And this has resulted in a spirited discussion among modern scholars about whether the formless abodes accurately reflect non-Buddhist teachings circulating during the Buddha's day. And if so, whether these practices are best characterized as Brahmanic or Upanishadic or Shramanic or Jain or what have you. All of these have been entertained by different scholars. Alternatively, some have suggested that the tale of Siddhartha's tutelage under his two teachers is a later interpolation intended to disparage the teachings of his religious rivals. The Buddhist commentarial tradition takes a further assumption. In their systematization of the teachings, Buddhist scholiasts place the four formless attainments, the four samapatis, above the dhyanas of form, the rupa dhyana, with respect to both spiritual achievement and cosmological geography. As a result, mastery of the four dhyanas of form came to be seen as prerequisite to the formless states, and this led early Buddhist writers to infer that Siddhartha learned all 8 meditative states, both the form and the formless dhyanas, under his first two teachers. But this creates a problem, as it appears to conflict with a popular early account of what transpired under the Bodhi tree. In this telling, Siddhartha's discovery of the middle way is prompted by a childhood memory. So I'm reading now from the Pali version of this. I recall that when my father, this is the Buddha talking, I recall that when my father, the Shakyan, was occupied, while I was sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, I entered upon and abided in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. Could that be the path to enlightenment? Then, following all that memory, came the realization, yes, that is indeed the path to enlightenment. Right, so that's a very popular story from the Pali Canon. It appears various times. Actually, interestingly, many scholars think this may be very early strata of the sutra materials. In other words, having rejected the path of self-mortification, Siddhartha finds himself at an impasse. He then recalls a time when, as a young child, sitting alone peacefully under a tree, he spontaneously enters the first rupa dhyana. This memory points him in the right direction, and he decides that pursuing dhyana is the correct course. But this is nuts, right? If, as later Buddhist commentators will claim, Siddhartha had already mastered all the dhyanas under the tutelage of his previous teachers, what is the point of this childhood memory? Why return to a path that he had previously mastered and emphatically rejected? Once again, we're led to the question of the relationship between Siddhartha's years of ascetic practice and his final attainment. Now, if you're familiar with the literature on this, you may suspect that the confusions surrounding the role of dhyana in Siddhartha's search is related to a broader issue that has drawn considerable attention among scholars over the past century. The Buddhist canon consists of not one, but several conflicting accounts of what happened under the Bodhi tree. Scholars sometimes divide the narratives into two types. There's the dhyana narrative and the insight narrative. And to greatly simplify things, in the former, which foregrounds the rose apple tree incident, Siddhartha's awakening occurs after he ascends through the 4 rupa dhyanas and then realizes the 3 higher knowledges, the trividya, and the 4 noble truths. In contrast, the insight narrative makes no mention of dhyana, but focuses instead on Siddhartha's discovery of and release from the chain of dependent origination. So when it comes to the nature and significance of the meditative states that Siddhartha mastered under his first teachers and the role of his childhood memory of dhyana, the narrative confusions may reflect a larger set of problems that Buddhist commentators encountered as they tried to reconcile multiple discrepant accounts, all of which enjoyed some canonical sanction. Okay. However, distinguishing between dhyana and insight narratives, which is very interesting, it doesn't in the end help with our particular quest, since all versions agree that Siddhartha achieved Buddhahood only after years of intense physical and mental discipline. So the question remains, was Siddhartha's ascetic ordeal a precondition for his final realization? Yes. Okay. So as mentioned above, Buddhist exegetes show scant interest in the soteriological significance of the Buddhist austerities, other than repeating the commonplace that they proved misguided. But the issue is not ignored entirely. It emerges, albeit obliquely, in a curious debate over whether a fully awakened being, a Buddha, still experiences the fruit of their own past karma. The scriptures depict the Buddha as subject to occasional verbal abuse and to physical pain, which naturally led commentators to question whether a fully liberated being, an arhat or a Buddha, continues to experience the fruits of past misdeeds. For example, on several occasions, the Buddha is falsely accused by female renunciates of having sex with them. These are the famous stories of Sandati and Chinchamana Vika. While the allegations are revealed to be desperate efforts by heretics to discredit the Buddha, one might still wonder how such an unfortunate event could happen to the Buddha. There's also several instances in which the Buddha experiences physical pain. During Devadatta's assassination attempt, for example, a splinter of rock strikes the Buddha's foot and draws blood. On various occasions, the Buddha is depicted as afflicted by backaches, by headaches, by dysentery, by malnutrition. And lest one think that the Buddha is unfeeling, the scriptures are clear, at least in some cases, that the pain is really intense. But even should the Buddha remain calmly indifferent, one still wonders, if all that happens is due to karma, what did the Buddha do such that he suffers? Okay, so the question, has anybody thought about this before? I was fascinated when I found this debate. The question is addressed at length in the Mendaka Panha, or the dilemmas section of the Milinda Panha, in which the author admits that the Buddha does indeed experience unpleasantness, but not because of his own past actions. According to Nagasena, a Buddha has expunged all past karma, and hence is not personally responsible for disagreeable things that arise. Rather, on the basis of scripture, Nagasena explains that unfortunate things sometimes just happen due to external circumstances. This is wild, right? This is not something I've ever taught my students. I always teach them everything is caused by karma, but Milinda says, no, sometimes just bad things happen to good people. So not everybody agreed with this. An opposing view is found in the Pubaka Mama Piloti, a Pali work, I pronounced that wrong, Pubakama Piloti, a Pali work in verse placed somewhat incongruously in the Theravada. Here the Buddha enumerates 12, or in one manuscript, 13 evil deeds he committed during his previous lifetimes, and how those deeds are responsible for the demeaning and painful events he encounters in his final birth. So in all but one instance, the unpleasant fruits of his past misdeeds occur after his awakening, including the libels perpetuated by these two prostitutes, the injury to his foot caused by Devadatta, his backaches, his headaches, his dysentery, his malnutrition, and so on. So the purport is clear. Everything experienced by a Buddha, including including unpleasantness, is brought about by his past actions. The attainment of bodhi does not entail escape from karma. Now, our concern today in this talk is with the single misdeed mentioned in the Pubbakama Piloti that bears its karmic fruit prior to Siddhartha's awakening. During the time of Kashyapa Buddha, when the Buddha-to-be was a Brahmin student named Jyotipala, he rudely defamed Kashyapa, casting doubt on his awakening. Okay, so Siddhartha, this is a past life of Siddhartha. He meets Kashyapa. He says, this guy's not awakened. He said, how could this bald ascetic be a Buddha? Jyotipala, he claims this, given that Buddhahood is so terribly difficult to achieve. So again, reading from this passage, he says, one time this is the Buddha speaking, one time, meaning in a past life, I, Jyotipala, said to Kashyapa, the well-gone one, whence then this baldy's waking up, awakening so hard to reach? As a result of that karma, I practiced great austerities in Uruvela 6 long years, and then achieved awakening. Okay, so in other words, Prince Siddhartha pays for doubting Kashyapa's Buddhahood on the grounds that attaining Buddhahood is so difficult to achieve. What he pays for that in his final life is that in his final birth, he would find attaining Buddhahood unnecessarily difficult to achieve. Siddhartha is fated by dint of his past karma to undergo 6 years of grueling austerities before realizing his mistake. Now, there's a lot of oddities in this story. As noted, the slandering of Kashyapa is an outlier in the list of the Buddha's past misdeeds, insofar as its effects are felt prior to his awakening. This renders the incident irrelevant in the debate over whether liberated beings experience the fruit of past karma. He's not liberated yet. Moreover, the story is found at the very end of the list, placing it out of chronological order. So all of this suggests that it may have been an afterthought, an opportunity for a creative exegete to address a potentially embarrassing event in the Buddha's life story. Now, as for the larger issue, the soteriological significance of Siddhartha's 6-year ordeal, the position of the Pubbakama Piloti appears both ad hoc and unsatisfying. We learn that the ascetic ordeal is simply the result of an offense that Siddhartha committed in a distant past life, a karmic debt to be paid for his defamation of Kashyapa. Explaining away the austerities by recourse to past karma is little more than a convenient evasion. Now, this kerfuffle over the Buddha's karma may have played a role in the emergence of the Lokottaravada and later Mahayana interventions, which approached the Buddha's practice of austerities, like so much else in his biography, as a sham, the manifestation of skillful means by a transcendent being who has no real need for practice of any kind. Be that as it may, the story of the Buddha-to-be's slander of Kashyapa is the only account of which I am aware that grapples with the soteriological necessity of Siddhartha's asceticism. Its argument is that it has no soteriological necessity. The austerities are simply the residue of his past karma. But playing the karma card fails to address the question of how karmic activity can bring about the end of karmic activity. And on this, the authors of both the Pubbakama Piloti and the Milinda Panha have little to offer. Okay? So, we are presented with a narrative structure here. A protagonist in search of a goal undergoes a protracted ordeal. The goal is attained, but only at the point in which the protagonist realizes that the ordeal was unnecessary. Now, this is a venerable narrative motif. Consider the film The Wizard of Oz. Can I presume that Many of you have seen The Wizard of Oz. Our hero, Dorothy, in her attempt to return home to Kansas, is sent on a daunting quest. She must retrieve the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West. And against all odds, she succeeds. She destroys the witch and retrieves the broomstick, only to learn that she didn't need the broomstick after all. She discovers that the power to return home was always within her. She just didn't know it. Glinda, the good witch, explains why she didn't tell Dorothy in the first place. She says Dorothy wouldn't have believed it. In the Buddhist tradition, there are countless stories that track the same narrative structure. To pick a celebrated example from the Chan tradition, the Buddhist monk Huike, in search of the way, sets out to find the enigmatic meditation teacher Bodhidharma. He discovers Bodhidharma sitting silently in a mountain cave facing a wall. Huike remains patiently outside in the cold, waiting for Bodhidharma to acknowledge his presence, but Bodhidharma is unmoved. Finally, with snow piling up around him, Huike cuts off his arm and presents it to Bodhidharma, and this gets the master's attention. The following dialogue ensues. Huike says, "Your disciple's mind is not at peace. I beg the master to put my mind at peace." Bodhidharma says, "Give me your mind and I'll put it at peace." Huike says, "I've searched for my mind, but in the end, I'm unable to get hold of it." Bukudo, right? Bodhidharma says, "There, I put your mind at peace for you." So Huike's very search for peace of mind was standing in the way of truth. When he realized that mind, along with suffering and path and goal, is empty or ungraspable, anupalabdhi, he attained what he was looking for. Now, this exchange is often seen as epitomizing the Chan notion of sudden awakening, since on the surface it would seem that Huike attained the goal as soon as he realized he was looking in the wrong place. The goal was right in front of him all along. He didn't have to break a sweat. But once again, this begs the question, would Bodhidharma's intervention have succeeded had Huike not first gone through the ordeal? His search through the mountains to find the master, the stinging rebuff from the master, the wait in the cold and the snow, and finally the bloody dismemberment. Now, in raising the case of Huike, it might seem that I'm putting a Chanish spin on the Buddha's awakening. But I intend to show that this is not the case, and that the Chan tale is simply riffing on a theme that can be traced back to early Buddhist sources. For what tale could be more quintessentially Chanish than that of Ananda's awakening? We finally arrived at Ananda. So among the gaggle of named followers of the Buddha in the early canon, Ananda stands out as particularly perplexing. On the one hand, he is the unfailing servant of the Buddha, who enjoyed the Buddha's companionship and trust for some 25 years. Without Ananda's earnest and selfless devotion, coupled with his prodigious memory, tradition holds that we would not have an accurate record of the Buddha's teachings. At the same time, Ananda is the only major disciple of the Buddha who failed to attain arhatship during the Buddha's lifetime. This is noteworthy given that arhatship is depicted as relatively common in the Buddha's day. Many people attain it on their first encounter with the Buddha's preaching. And nobody was present for more of the Buddha's preaching than Ananda. So Ananda is also renowned for his bungling. He is almost comically inept at times. On one occasion, he goes out on a begging bowl without having donned his outer robes. Astoundingly, when admonished, his excuse is that he forgot. This is from the monk who managed to remember every word that the Buddha ever spoke. So poor Ananda is ultimately held responsible for a host of problems that would plague the saṃgha following the Buddha's passing. He's blamed, for example, for the creation of the nuns' order, to which the Buddha consented only after Ananda's repeated badgering. The Buddha clearly thought it a bad idea, And he prophesies that as a result, the time of the dispensation, the buddhaśāsana, would be reduced significantly. Another example, at several points, the Buddha informs Ananda that following the Buddha's nirvana, the saṃgha would be strict in enforcing the major rules, but they can be flexible when it comes to the minor rules. Ananda, demonstrating his singular obtuseness, fails to ask the Buddha which rules are the major ones and which are the minor ones. And this contributes to endless controversy and even schism within the saṃgha later on. Most damning, however, was Ananda's failure to take the hint when the Buddha repeatedly informs him that a Buddha, upon request, can extend his own lifetime to the very end of an eon. Had Ananda only made this simple request when prompted to do so, the Buddha would still be with us today. It's Ananda's fault. So it would seem that the saṃgha was happy to pin any and all of the tradition's perceived shortcomings on Ananda. And Ananda is duly forced to confess his transgressions at the first council, which he does, but he does it reluctantly. Now, scholars have tended various theories to explain why Ananda, who had such a privileged place among the Buddha's senior disciples, nonetheless should be depicted in the canon as a bit of a buffoon. One possibility is that the early tradition wanted to shield the Buddha from blame for embarrassments, such as the Buddha's early demise, or for later discord within the saṃgha. Responsibility for these and other failures could all be pinned on his faithful but hapless attendant. Surely the Buddha, with his supernatural powers, could have lived beyond the age of 80 had Ananda not botched things. Surely the omniscient Buddha could have averted later schism if only Ananda had not fumbled the ball thrown to him. And surely the Buddha knew that creating an order of nuns was not in the interest of the saṃgha, or more to the point, in the saṃgha patriarchy. Responsibility for all this and more lies with Ananda. Ananda turns out to be a convenient scapegoat precisely because he is always on the scene. Now, another explanation for the damning depiction of Ananda is what might be called the sour grapes theory. According to this theory, I'm not making this up, by the way, this is all pulled out of the scholarly literature. According to this theory, the historical Ananda garnered enemies among the Buddha's senior disciples who resented his privileged access to the master. As evidence, scholars point out that Ananda is regularly depicted reporting the misdeeds of fellow monastics to the Buddha. Surely this would not have endeared him to his peers. So the depiction of Ananda as a rube may have originated from elders in the early community who were envious and mistrustful of his special status. Now, there's one more explanation based on a doctrinal tension that emerged between different Buddhist schools. Scholars have noted that some canonical accounts of the First Council, including those of the Theravada and the Mahasaṅgika, place Vinaya above the Sutra, while others, including the Sarvastivada and Muda Sarvastivada, place Sutra above Vinaya. Partisans of Vinaya, for example, give precedence to Upali and Dasaka at the First Council, both of whom are masters of the Vinaya, and they're the ones who are allowed to speak first. But the Sutra camp, in contrast, gives pride of place to Mahakāshyapa and Ananda. So according to this theory, those who favored Vinaya may have been responsible for denigrating Ananda and, by association, the sutras. Now, our interest, however, is not in speculation about the historical circumstances that may lie behind the narrative depictions of Ananda, but rather in the pattern structure of the narrative itself. And the first thing to note is that Ananda gets a bum rap. For one thing, Ananda stands out as the only member of the Buddha's inner circle who defers his own liberation in order to serve the Buddha and his mission. Insofar as he places the spiritual welfare of others above himself, he is a precursor of a Mahayana bodhisattva. And again, I'm not making this up. It's found in the medieval Dajir Dulun, for example, which claims that Ananda's non-liberated status is a sign of his selflessness and altruism. Ananda could have become an arhat sooner, but to have done so would have interfered with his service to the Dharma. Ananda's conduct anticipates other strands of Mahayana thought as well. His insistence that women are as capable of liberation as are men might be placed in this category. But more relevant to our immediate concern is the manner in which his example attests to the limits of doctrinal knowledge and conceptual understanding. Consider this. Nobody had a more complete knowledge of the Buddha's teachings, most of it firsthand, than did Ananda. Moreover, he had the astonishing ability to recall it perfectly at will. And yet this vast trove of ready knowledge did not bring about his own liberation. When, following the Buddha's death, he is suddenly under intense pressure to attain arhatship so as to gain admission to the first council, he turns to the practice of dhyana. Okay? So we're now closing in on the issue with which we began, namely the relationship between practice and liberation. To put the matter simply, insofar as the goal of practice is understood to be nirvana, and nirvana is understood to be the cessation of karma, the question is how karmic activity of any kind, and clearly the practice of dhyana is a form of karmic activity, how it could bring about the cessation of karma. Now, this was not a problem just for the Buddhists. Virtually all of the early Indian shamanic traditions wrestled with it. Some, like the Jains, stared the issue squarely in the face and concluded that the only solution is to cease from doing anything at all, to put an end to both physical and mental activity. The preeminent form of Jain practice includes going without food, remaining silent and immobile, and stopping the breath. Of course, if done to the letter, this will lead to death, but a death that is liberation. It is moksha, an end to suffering and rebirth. Now, others, like the Ajivakas, confronted the same problem but came to a very different conclusion. They reasoned that it was simply impossible to intervene in or alter the unfolding of karma. Everything is predetermined by fate, and there is nothing one can do about it. And as a result, they countenanced a kind of impassive resignation or inaction. But of course, trying not to do anything, as the Jains did, or adopting a stance of stoic resignation, as the Ajivikas did, is still doing something. And both the Jain and the Ajivaka traditions are explicitly repudiated by the Buddha. The kind of asceticism and practice of austerities, or tapas, directed to the elimination or termination of karma is rejected in favor of a path that foregrounds insight. And this is true across all of the accounts of the Buddha's awakening, both the insight and the dhyana narratives. In each case, the actual moment of liberation coincides with a realization of some kind. Even in the so-called dhyana narrative, in which the Buddha's nirvana is preceded by his ascent and descent and ascent again through the four rupa dhyanas, the process culminates not in a state of absorption or cessation, but rather in a moment of realization or illumination or discovery. The scriptural sources provide conflicting accounts of the content of this realization. It's variously described as the three higher knowledges, the Trividya, of which there are different enunciations, or insight into the Four Noble Truths, or insight into the Ashavas, the contaminants, or insight into dependent origination, or into no self, or into the fact of liberation itself, and so on. But whatever the content, it's the realization of the true nature of things and not the mere cessation of cognition or karma per se that characterizes liberation. Indeed, it is this understanding of liberation that allows moksha to be attained while one is still alive, an important point of doctrine that differentiates Buddhism from some of its shamanic rivals. So in sum, the conundrum is that it would seem impossible for any karmic activity, whether it be ascetic discipline or yogic exertion or cultivation of trance or what have you, to bring about the final cessation of all activity. So one common Buddhist resolution of this conundrum is to place not so much stress on ascetic or yogic practice per se, but on a realization or insight that would appear to transcend the inexorable flow of karma. But the question remains, what is the relationship between this moment of liberated insight and the effortful practice that preceded it? How does one occasion a mode of cognition that is said to be free of intention and desire without intending or desiring it? Back to Ananda. There are multiple accounts of how Ananda attained arhat status in different vinaya, but the general outline of the story is roughly the same. Following the Buddha's final nirvana, the elders decide to convene a council at which they would recite and codify the Buddha's teachings. Many elders considered Ananda's presence at the council crucial, as he was at the Buddha's side for much of his teaching career and had a comprehensive knowledge of the sermons. But some elders resisted the idea of allowing Buddha in, both because he was not yet an arhat and because of his many blunders, some of which I mentioned above. Some texts record a list of demeanors. Sometimes there are 6, sometimes there are 8. Now, the narratives differ in detail, but there is a general agreement that Ananda ended up with one night to get his act together. He was given one night to attain arhatship before the council, and so he gets to work. Now, the best known version of what happens next may be found in chapter 11 of the Pali Cūllavagga. So I quote, "Then the Venerable Ananda, thinking, 'Tomorrow is the assembly. Now it is not suitable in me that I, being only a learner, should go to the assembly.' And having passed much of that night in mindfulness as to body, when the night was nearly spent, he thought," so he'd been meditating hard all night, he thought, "I will lie down." So he inclined his body, but before his head had touched the mattress, and while his feet were free from the ground, they're up from the ground, in that interval, his mind was freed from the cankers with no residuum for rebirth remaining. I'm sorry, this is an old Horner translation, but it's what I had. Then the Venerable Ananda, being a perfected one, went to the assembly. Okay, so that's the Cūllavagga version, which is considered very early. A more elaborate account is found in the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, extant in Chinese translation. In this telling, Vajjiputta, an arhat with the power to know the thoughts of others, detects that Ananda is not yet freed of cravings. So he then delivers a little verse on detachment for Ananda's benefit. And the verse is, "Dwelling quietly under an empty tree, contemplating nirvana, sitting in meditation without distraction, what is the point of the various teachings?" So the narrative then continues, quote, "At that time, Ananda, having heard the monk Vajjiputta's teaching on detachment, retired to a secluded place and exerted himself ceaselessly with quiet focus. This was a practice Ananda had never experienced before. Then Ananda spread out a rope mat on the ground and practiced walking back and forth continuously throughout the night. The night passed, and as dawn was about to break, he was utterly exhausted. He said to himself, 'I'm now exhausted. Perhaps I should sit down for a bit.' And having this thought, he sat down.
But as soon as he sat down, he had the urge to lie down. Many of you have probably experienced this. Before his head reached the pillow, in that very instant, his mind attained the liberation that is free from defilement. At that moment, he attains arhatship. Now, not all the traditions were happy with Ananda gaining liberation in the act of taking a break. The Mulasarvasta Vinaya, for example, has Ananda continuing his meditation practice while he is lying down, thereby attaining arhatship without abandoning his effort. I'll read you this one as well. You'll see that they're jimmying it, right? All day, Ananda spent in either sitting or walking practice, purifying his mind of all obstructions. He continued through the early evening, sometimes walking, sometimes sitting, purifying his mind of obstructions. When it came to the middle of the night, he washed his feet, entered the room, and lay down on his right side with one foot on top of the other, and gave rise to a mind of clear awareness and correct mindfulness. With this focused attention, before his head even reached the pillow, his mind attained liberation, freed from all defilement. And so on. I also have here a quote, but it's getting on time, so I'm going to skip the Mahasangika Vinaya, but it's the same. You can see, at least in my view, they're upset by these early accounts of Ananda attaining liberation at the moment when he stopped trying, right? So I would argue that the later narratives are willfully diluting the story. The Pali Cūllavagga version, as well as the slightly longer Dharmaguptaka account, both state unambiguously that Ananda attained the goal the very instant that he gave it up. Indeed, he achieves arhatship in the act of lying down to sleep. To put it mildly, this is an unconventional, if not unorthodox, account of the attainment of the very highest goal of Buddhist practice. And just in case, this is the clincher, just in case the reader misses the irony, the text reinforces the anomalous character of Ananda's accomplishment, emphasizing that he is in none of the four postures, the four recognized postures of Buddhist practice at the moment of his liberation. That is, he's not walking or standing or sitting or lying down, right? If his feet were still on the floor, he would be standing, but if his head was on the pillow, he would be lying, and he's doing neither. Right? In that moment, suspended as it were in midair, he lets go of all effort and all desire, including the effort and desire to attain liberation, and in that moment he reaches the goal. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up now. Ananda dared challenge the Buddha over his refusal to countenance an order of nuns, and Ananda's progressive position triumphed over the Buddha's more traditional, dare we say, patriarchal stance. Today, if pressed, I suspect that many Buddhists would agree that this was for the best. Ananda's unapologetic support of women, predicated as it was on the spiritual potential of women, not to mention the Buddha's personal debt to his stepmother, seems more in line not only with contemporary mores, but also with modern readings of early Buddhist teachings. It might also be for the best that Ananda never gave the Buddha the opportunity to clarify which of the Vinaya rules are major and thus inviolable, and which are minor and thus able to be modified or discarded. As a result, each generation is forced to work it out for themselves. While some more conservative monastic communities may elect to follow all the regulations laid down by the Buddha, or at least give it a good shot, others embrace the scripturally sanctioned freedom to interpret and adapt the 2 millennia old code with an eye to prevailing circumstances. Along similar lines, this is more controversial, some might consider it for the best that the Buddha passed into nirvana when he did, rather than living on to the end of the eon. There are benefits in compelling followers of a religious tradition to work through the teachings for themselves. to learn from their own discoveries and failures, rather than remaining dependent on the guidance and oversight of an ever-present and all-knowing master. Besides, as the Buddha emphasized, everything is impermanent, and we know that charismatic sages have a way of morphing over time into reactionary autocrats. For all this and more, we have Ananda to thank. So in this reading, rather than being a foil or a hapless buffoon, Ananda embodies a kind of crazy but prophetic wisdom. Now, this is admittedly an unconventional reading of the figure of Ananda depicted in the early sources, but it is also an eminently defensible one. After all, why would the omniscient Buddha choose an incompetent fool to be his personal attendant and custodian of his teachings? Ananda is needed to keep the Buddha in check, to keep his feet on the ground. And perhaps this is why, when forced to repent for his supposed misdeeds at the first council, Ananda does so half-heartedly at best. We must imagine Ananda submitting to the punishment doled out by the dour elders of his community with a percipient twinkle in his eye. So we can now better appreciate Ananda's lesson on the paradoxical nature of awakening. Awakening consists in letting go of everything, including the effort to let go of everything. But to let go of something, you must first have a firm grasp on it. So to return to the question with which we started, just as Dorothy had to retrieve the broomstick of the wicked witch to understand that it wasn't needed, that she was already in possession of what she was seeking, the Buddha too had no choice but to undergo his 6-year ordeal. This is the insight captured in the koan of Ananda's awakening. Now again, you might suspect me of imposing a kind of Zen-y reading on the figure of Ananda, of anachronistically turning him into a whimsical Zen master. But I would contend that the opposite is the case. Chan, or Zen, did not invent Ananda. This bodhisattva-like persona, who sets aside his own liberation in order to serve the Buddha Dharma, who dares at times to strategically ignore or even to challenge the Buddha, whose personal story demonstrates that mastery of the Buddha's words alone will not bring one to liberation, and whose liberation occurs precisely in the act of abandoning the search for liberation. That's all there in the early literature. So the figure of Ananda captures a kind of self-reflexive and self-critical strand in the early Buddhist teachings that in going meta threatens to subvert the entire enterprise. Chan, or Zen, didn't contrive this position any more than Nagarjuna did. Chan and Zen, following Ananda, simply put a spotlight on it. Thank you.